Armored Warriors, a 1994 Capcom arcade beat-em-up, released in the pinnacle of that genre's reign. Streets of Rage, X-Men, Simpsons, and from Capcom itself, Aliens vs. Predator, Dungeons & Dragons, Tower of Doom, and Shadows of Mystara. They were all out, taking quarters and blistering thumbs. In that sea of amazing titles, this is a gem like many gems in the 1990s that didn't get a lot of, if any, attention in North America or Europe. But it also didn't see a lot of distribution even in Japan. So just to start off with before anything else, I gotta mention this title. I mean seriously, Armored Warriors? At first glance, it seems like a generic, somewhat uninspired name to a video game, or really any other media. In Japan, the title is Powered Gear Strategic Variant Armored Equipment. Now, that's a mouthful, but the name Powered Gear sounds pretty good, especially compared to Armored Warriors. Maybe it's just me, but the name implies a serious deficit in creativity, which is ironic considering what the game turned out to be. Although I've got a theory on why they picked that name. So, despite the name, the game actually has one of the best plots and stories I've seen for an arcade beat-em-up. The story is surprisingly interesting and expertly paced for an arcade game. There's a brief text scroll when you first fire the game up, and then the rest is told to you through dialogue boxes, both between stages and at some boss encounters. Critically for the story bits, you can quickly and smoothly move past them with a tap of any of the buttons, not forcing you into any drawn-out delays to the gameplay. After all, this is an arcade game. To briefly talk about the story itself, this is where my theory from earlier about the title comes into play. So in this game's world, there's humans and an alien race called the Principalities of Raya, who are basically just purple people. They've had a 50-year war just come to a conclusion. Rogue elements have started trouble in the capital city of Raya, called Melkide, and the Earth government has dispatched special troops to quell the fighting, but have aims at taking over. So, just in that brief summary alone, if you're familiar with a few mech animes, you can see there's been some, let's call it inspiration, drawn from what appears to be Mobile Suit Gundam and Armored Trooper Votoms. From Gundam, you have the dynamic of the Earth government and the Principality of Raya. Armored Trooper Votoms has similar types of alien special soldiers with the purple hue about them as well. Also, the general presentation reminds me a lot of that show, particularly when these soldiers who have nothing but small arms try and shoot you down when you're in your massive powered mech. Something that really reminds me strongly of some of the combat in Armored Trooper Votoms and Gundam between people and mechs. Also, Melkide sounds quite a bit like Melkia, a major race in Votoms. Anyway, moving on. It's a beat-em-up, isn't it? Well, yeah, it's a beat-em-up, and this is an awesome one at that. The gameplay combined with the presentation is where this title really shines through. To start off with, one of the most important aspects of the game, but really any arcade action game, is the controls, which are damn near flawless. You've got the legendary 90s Capcom fighting game masters putting together another great control scheme. The player unit is responsive, and the controls are simple enough to pick up and feel good at right away. Of course, I'm playing on an emulator and using an arcade stick, which probably makes things easier since I don't have to deal with the gunked up joystick and broken buttons from hundreds of other players. Gameplay is simple, but very satisfying. The core gameplay loop of smashing your weapons into enemies is also extremely satisfying. The animation lends itself to a sense of impact when your mech hits. Not quite as good as Streets of Rage, but an excellent translation of force. There are a ton of different weapons, arms, and legs for your mech to equip right on the fly, which provides great replay value to try out different combos. One of the things I really like about this system is that none of the attachments feel especially gimp or crappy. They are all fun to play with and make your mech feel powerful as you plow through enemies. Even your starting loadout's not terrible. I view it as a triumph of game design to make all the mechs, parts, and weapons feel both fun to use and play differently from each other. Graphics and animation are also very impressive. Again, this was released in 1994 and has the same excellent sprite work you see in other titles, such as the aforementioned Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom, AVP, and X-Men Children of the Atom games. As a side note, these Capcom games all shared the same core hardware setup, something called the CP System 2, which also has its own unique history, particularly in regards to copyright. Anyway, despite being developed by Capcom, Armored Warriors reminds me of the series Metal Slug. There's a strong similarity in the method they both use to present a quasi-military theme with a touch of science fiction and the fantastic. The presentation has a look that immediately is attention-grabbing, and you'd of course need that in an arcade competitive cabinet. It looks like an anime you're playing through, and credit has to be given to the animators and artists for extreme attention to detail and just overall outstanding effort. Soundtrack is also extremely high quality in this game as well. There's some high energy tracks that flow perfectly with the on-screen action. The final aspect I want to touch on is the difficulty. I've done a run of this game to see if I could beat it with 10 credits, and on my first attempt I got pretty far into the game. The weapons and attachments are powerful, and more importantly make your mech feel powerful. With some practice, I'm confident this game could be beat at 50 cents a credit with about $5. This is defo still an arcade game with stages and bosses being pretty tough, but I find the challenge to be exceptionally fair, especially given some of Capcom's other titles. There's no one-hit death moves or insta-kill traps or platforms to fall in a la Double Dragon, so the player has a reasonable chance of success with just your own skills and reaction. Maybe that fairness is one of the reasons the game was never heavily circulated, whether in the US or Japan. As I mentioned earlier, the game didn't really have great distribution in North America or Japan. However, elements of this game were popular enough that a spiritual successor to the game was created called Cyberbots: Full Metal Madness. Cyberbots is a tournament fighting style game that Capcom must have felt had a bit more potential than Armored Warriors, seeing as the game was ported to the original PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Armored Warriors' legacy would also live on through a character that was brought over from Cyberbots to a game that became much more popular. Overall, I'd say my experience with this is that this is definitely one of my favorite arcade beat-em-ups. Gameplay, graphics, and controls are awesome, but I also really appreciate the addition of a tight and concise story, since that really gets me into the game even more. I never saw this cabinet back in the 90s when it was new, but I know I would have dropped a pocket full of tokens in back in the day. Fortunately, if you want to play the game now, you can, as it's available in the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle that you can get on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. So if you got $20, go out and get it along with the other great bunch of top tier Capcom titles. Anyway, thanks for watching, appreciate it, and we will see you next time. See ya.